Hello, welcome to week 7 of pivoting, and we're going to be talking about sustainability focused opportunities today. I'm Susan Nash. I'm Director of Innovation, Emerging Science and Technology at AAPG. And I'm really happy to say that this is an ongoing series that's designed to help people who are interested in diversifying and finding new revenue sources. And it's designed also for our members in transition. I want to give a special shout out to Julia Lemaster, who's helping us with our marketing, with the promotion for with our members in transition. So today I'd like to introduce our speakers, our panelists. We have Alexander Rozenfeld at Climate Impact Capital. We have John Hofmeister, who's with CFAE, Citizens for Affordable Energy. We have Hamed Soroush, PetroLern, and we have Rick Schrynemeeckers, AGI Survey. I also see some great people in the audience, and I'm also happy to announce that today, actually probably late tonight, I'll have the applications for our virtual internship program, which is actually being done with Tulsa Geological Society and which in affiliation with AAPG. So anyway, just want to thank you, everyone. And as we get started, I also want to introduce our special co-host for our series, Dr. Larry Davis. So Larry, would you like to say hello very quickly, and then we'll
hello, everyone. You have this program structured. I've thought about something I want to present just briefly, an observation that I made. The theme that you have presented is pivoting. And I guess there could be consideration of permanent pivoting or temporary pivoting. And I've noticed that a lot of the pivoting of companies has related to providing supplies that are related to the pandemic, such as those companies making transitions to or pivoting to make masks. And there's so many companies doing that. I'm just wondering what the supplies, the surplus is going to be when this is over. And that kind of pivoting has to be temporary. I think a focus maybe could be to pivoting and adjusting businesses to permanent new directions that they could have, and to sustain their business to move forward without the interruptions when the pandemic is, I started to say over, but I don't know if it'll ever be over, it diminished. So that's an observation that I had today. Anyway, I'm glad to be here, and I look forward to the presentations. They're always excellent, and I know they will be tonight. So let's get on with the show.
Thank you. So just to let you know, as we always introduce, Dr. Larry Davis is in the economics, the professor of economics at Texas A&M Texarkana. So he's our stalwart guide here. So our first presenter is Alexander Rozenfeld, and just wanted to see if you could share your screen, and we'll get started.
Okay, let's do that. Yes, okay, and there we go, and share. Perfect. So does everyone see my screen?
Yes.
We do. Okay, and I see quite a lot of folks here. Okay, perfect. So great. Well, great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me, Susan. And this is not the first time I've partnered with you guys, so very glad to be back. And certainly, happy to be on the same panel with John, with whom I share a history back in Shell. John certainly left as a very senior, the very senior president. I left Shell as a background 4 years ago as president of Shell Technology Ventures, LLC. So a very little president to start my own thing, but I think we have a lot in common here, all the panelists, Susan, that you assembled, that we all, are very passionate about the energy transition and finding a sustainable pathway to that. So that's what my talk is going to be, is to give some people, both experts as well as novices in the space, a little bit of background as to where we see things happening from the perspective of our firm, which focuses on energy, food, and water, and finding a sustainable pathway to the future. So always have to flash this on the screen. We're not providing investment advice to anyone. So just as kind of background, where our mission is for CIC is that we work really deeply with corporates around the energy transition and elements of that. And the reason we do that is that, you know, number one is that the corporations have a big role to play in the future of the transition, but also for those who have been looking at the aspects of greenhouse gas management, about 70% of the greenhouse gases are locked in by major corporations around the world through things like refineries and cement plants and buildings. So there's no way around being able to fix the problem without the major corporations of the world working on these things together. And so we work with the corporations to help them transform and transition to the energy future, and looking particularly at things in energy, food, and water, but certainly also covering things like material and mobility. And these are really 5 themes for anyone who's trying to transition in the future that we think will become more and more important in the real economy. So why is this important, and why is there opportunity in the space? The big reason for the opportunity is that generally both countries at the country level, foundations and certainly corporations have been underinvesting in this sector for forever, basically. And it's been a combination of they don't like the risk levels of investing in things that are tied to climate mitigation. The focus has typically been on more mature technologies rather than on things that are earlier in the funnel that have more of a risk to them. There's been a lot of geographical bias around investing into, again, countries where there's a lot of surety versus into Africa and Asia, where there's a lot of opportunity to both make a return and make an impact, but the challenges there. And generally, again, kind of as, from our background and on the corporate side, earlier stage, smaller deals are typically overlooked because it's easier to do a large later stage deal, and that's just been the bias in the market. So we think early stage innovation, although it's been losing ground versus others, there's a lot of opportunity to come in at an individual level for someone who's starting companies, but also at the corporate levels where we work at. And for those, again, who are not as much familiar with what's driving this, it's really goes to the fundamental demographics of the world. One is that we're heading towards 10 billion people with up to 100% increase in food demand. The rise in manufacturing and water demand is going alongside that as well, and certainly as is energy consumption. And given what I said before, where we have so much of already the greenhouse gases locked in, that are needed to be reduced to meet the Paris targets, we can't continue raising manufacturing 400%, growing twice as much food and raising the amount of energy and have a sustainable, even 3-degree world. So how does this connect into the big risks? And we like the World Economic Forum. I'm an advisor there, but they do a good job year on year in a fairly nonpartisan way about addressing what the biggest risks are. And for the last number of years, they've been saying, extreme weather events and failure of climate change mitigation are not just the top likely events, but they are the largest impacts. And if you kind of look at the other ones where they're related, they're all environmental. The only thing that hits the top of the list, which all of us hope don't happen, are weapons of mass destruction. So aside from that, it's pretty clear picture of where innovation and opportunities are in the sector. And as we had talked about the gap, this gap has been fairly clearly defined, and it's a very large one. It's between 1.6 and 3.8 trillion. And as they say, what's a trillion between friends? So that's the opportunity for corporations to come in, the opportunity for governments to invest into new companies, and it's the opportunities for entrepreneurs to start new business. And we have to kind of fundamentally believe that at some point we will hit enough of a crisis point, as we are with COVID-19 right now, that the governments of the world will turn around, the policies of the world will turn around. There'll be significant carbon taxes, there'll be significant incentives to change the economy and significant disincentives to do the way things are. And so this is money we think that is up for grabs in the future. The question is how fast that money will be deployed. We're fairly positive that the world will have to do that once it becomes more and more inevitable. So for those who are thinking through where are the places, if you want to start a business, if you want to invest in a business, if you're just interested in the sector, where has the money been made? So this is a review by Cambridge Associates, which is a big private equity firm that does a lot of tracking. And they looked back across all their data to see where the large internal rates of return have been. And it gives a feeling for which of these sectors are likely to get further investment in the future. And a lot of the sectors are fairly interesting ones from a technical point of view and certainly from a business point of view. At the top, hopefully everyone can see, is a smart grid and energy storage. Those are two particularly exciting ones because the utilities are in the state of transition that oil and gas was probably like 30, 40 years ago. So except the difference is that oil and gas companies woke up to the realization that their business is changing a long time ago and have just been slowly making a change. Utilities are waking up and realizing that they might be out of business, like PG&E, within a very short period due to a number of environmental and other impacts. And so there's going to be a huge transition to the smart grid, which energy storage is enabling. And those two factors are also the key enablers to bring on a significant wind and solar resources. Because as those come in, and I think there are 7 states, though, maybe even more than that, that have renewable mandates of 80 to 100% by starting at 2030. To be able to get in that level of renewables, there's going to have to be a huge transition in number of technologies, and smart grid and energy storage are very high. And if you go down two further around sustainable mobility, this is where opportunities around vehicle to grid, bringing in your Tesla or your Prius and connecting that to your home and using that as a battery to be soaking up solar and wind energy. Those are all the top business models. And as you can see, they're having great returns, even though in fact the challenges that they're addressing haven't been really seen in the market in a real way. So to kind of almost finishing up here is, where do we see the impact and how does this all fit together? So first we see that corporations are moving from the state of climate unaware to climate beware, where they're taking very much of a significant capital position and significant strategy position around moving into that space. So certainly Shell and BP have committed to be net zero, and not just net zero on the emissions that they make internally, but on the emissions that their products make. And then other companies are beginning to very seriously look at how to reduce that. As an example, Occidental has bought in significantly into direct air capture technologies. So there's a very strong move in oil and gas, and then following a move there'll be a followed move in other industries. And so where we see the opportunities is really tied to these 4 categories of real asset risks, stranded technology, regulatory risks, and social buying preferences. And all of these 4 risks are very much tied to climate change, which we see impacting the real and the financial economy quite a bit. And this is going to lead to a lot more opportunities. Under stranded technologies, you see this distributed power smart grid that I mentioned. We see a lot of opportunity covering water treatment and desalination. For those that follow the Department of Energy, they just issued a new renewables to desalination challenge that they're funding. Certainly regulatory costs are going to be driving a lot of changes into energy efficiency. And then we also, I think everyone's aware of a lot of the social buying preferences around buying goods that are sustainable and recycled, both at the consumer level, but I think that's also moving further into the commodity businesses. So I think those are where all the pieces are. We see them really driving change, and we also see a lot of opportunities. So we're very positive about the number of opportunities out there. We are a little hesitant about when that capital is going to come in. We're not seeing the capital moving as quickly as it should. But at some point, there's going to be a rush, and I think the people and the companies that are ready and prepared for that are going to have a great opportunity. So that was my little talk. I hope I kept that on time, and so we'll have questions either now, Susan, or we can hold them all to the end.
Let's hold them till later so we can kind of synthesize. But that was really interesting, Alex. I really appreciate it. Also, thank you for sharing your contact information. And I also just want to remind everyone that you'll get an email, the link to the recording, and also contact information. So thank you. And I'd like to invite John Hofmeister, our next presenter, to present. And as he's getting his slides, he might need to unshare, Alex. And as he's getting his ready, I just want to mention that this is part one of our Sustainable Solutions for the Energy Transition series. And our next part will be on July 22nd, which is week 12, and we'll have Miriam Winston of Mangrum Hill and Edith Wilson, who's going to talk about battery tech and opportunities in energy transition and critical minerals. We'll also have Cynthia Docre of Maxar. They're a satellite company, they own satellites. And we'll have Anna D'Alessandra of the Uvalde Group, and she'll talk about 3D printing for sustainability. So this is part one, and next part, and just coincidentally, this is all men, the next one is all women. So I don't know, just happened that way. It's kind of funny. Anyway, so John, would you like to share your slides?
Yes, Susan, I don't have any slides. I'd prefer
Okay,
to just simply talk with everyone, if I may.
Perfect, okay.
And I'd like to start by thanking you for the invitation to be a part of this. And what I'm hoping to do and accomplish in these few minutes is to help build the vocabulary that I think we all need to express to our friends, our families, our communities, the message of the future from the oil and gas industry, from the energy industry broadly writ. And I spend most of my time now, since I retired as Shell Oil president 12 years ago, most of my time in the public domain, whether it's teaching at several universities, whether it's speaking to the public, whether it's serving on various industry boards and trying to help people understand the future. The favorite question I take from audiences is, if you were advising young people today on a career in oil and gas, what would you say to them? And I always answer it the same way, from when I was Shell Oil president to today, that the oil and gas opportunity is one of three economic sectors that challenge the human capacity of individuals greater than any other sector. And other than the three sectors that challenge human capacity, and that is the ability to create, to innovate, and to do. The three sectors are aerospace, which really stresses all that we know of physics, engineering, and so on. Medicine, which again stresses all of the capacity of individuals, and oil and gas. And what they have in common is they demand the greatest level of cognitive capacity that we can come up with. That is our intelligence, our judgment, our synthesis, our integration skills. They also risk life and death on a daily basis. Aerospace, medicine, oil and gas. And they are also essential to the future of mankind. And we can't do without. And so if you choose an oil and gas career, and people say, well, the industry's going to go away. And I say immediately to them, your grandchildren are going to be looking at opportunities in oil and gas. But at the same time, the greatest challenge that oil and gas faces today is the simple license to operate. Our license to operate as an industry is being challenged like never before. And it has everything to do, as it should, with worries about the future and the climate of the earth that we inhabit. And we have to take responsibility as an industry for what are we going to do about that. The fundamental fear that I believe the industry faces is the ability to fund itself. Because energy is such demand, but also because human capability is so responsive to that demand, we have an oil price issue, a gas price issue, which may lead to questions about the return on investment or the risk that people are willing to take. And of course, we've seen the debacle in shale oil in which business models didn't function. Many shale companies were working on negative cash flow, and that's not a good way to run a company, negative cash flow. And who's going to invest in the future? For one of two reasons: low returns, which is a financial issue, or worries about the climate, which is a much bigger issue that relates to ESG. That is the state of the environment, the state of society, and the state of the governance of companies. And so if you can't get money, what happens to the future of the industry? You shrink. As we shrink, of course, that'll change the price ratio. And the price will rise because we're not producing enough energy. But if we're not producing energy with an extraordinary commitment to changing our environmental outlook and our environmental performance, then we deserve to go down. I think that we're on the cusp of creating an entirely new aspect of the energy industry, which I'll come to before I conclude. But the dilemma that we face is the continuous demand for what we produce, molecules to make electrons. That's not going to go away. And as Alex said so clearly, the demand for future rise in population, food, and all of the requirements. And don't forget, we have the capacity to end global poverty. There's no other factor on Earth as much as energy to reduce or eliminate to eradicate global poverty as what's inherent in electrons and the molecules that the molecules and the electrons we produce. But the negative backdrop should not be underestimated. There was a very well-read letter, well-written letter, both, published in January of 2020 from Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock. BlackRock is a $1 trillion investment company, the largest investor in most industries anywhere in the world. And he cautioned, seriously cautioned, the industry's ability to meet its climate requirements, its climate obligations, which is why you hear the greatest leaders of the industry today, the CEOs of the major integrated companies, and including Shell, including BP, including ExxonMobil, including Chevron, and others, Total should include, the majors, and Saudi Aramco, put them in a list as well. They're all talking about the great 21st century energy transition. We're just at the beginning of it, but it's a very eventful beginning. And as we build momentum and we see the actions taking place where companies like BP or Shell or Total commit to being carbon neutral by 2050 with ambitions to become net carbon negative by 2070, that's a pretty big commitment. And so what the question of what we need to do to answer it, to make our businesses sustainable, to make sure that we have the energy we need, but also achieve the license to operate requirements of the future, we have some specific responsibilities, starting with cleaning up our existing businesses. We have a responsibility as an industry to take some serious actions. The notion of flaring production gas, how ridiculous is that in the scheme of things? To waste that valuable resource for the sake of not spending the money that it takes to contain it. Well, it's possible to contain gas in the oil fields and to monetize it if we commit ourselves to it. You know, if you look at a satellite map of the United States at night, and you look at the flaring from the Bakken formation, it exceeds the lumens coming off the great city of Minneapolis. And from a satellite, how ridiculous is that? The millions of people living around Minneapolis not using the light versus the open flaring in the Bakken formation. I encourage you to Google a night map of the United States and look for yourself. You can see Bakken sitting up there in North Dakota with the same lumens or more than you would see with Minneapolis. So flaring, water management, fracking, and the methodologies we use for fracking, including the fluids, our pipeline integrity, the efficiency of our operations, just to mention a few. These are must-dos within companies to make sure that there is a plan, a strategy, and a plan to make sure that we fix ourselves with the things we can fix ourselves. The next part is to increase the use of alternatives. And some companies are doing that. Whether it has to do, yes, thank you for putting that slide up. You can see flaring at night in the Bakken oil fields, incredible. Then the whole expansion of wind and solar and biomass and hydrogen and nuclear, we're going to need all of that energy for electrons. So why are we holding back? We shouldn't be holding back. There is an investment case to be made. And whether it's the oil and gas majors or the oil and gas companies branching out into new endeavors, that's their choice. But as a totality on Earth and energy provisioning, we really have to expand the role of alternatives if we're going to achieve what we committed to in the Paris Accords. The big deal, however, the very big deal that I think is really starting to get a grip, because major universities are linking into it. Major companies are now articulating it and setting commitments, like I mentioned, carbon neutral or carbon negative. It is the whole new industry that may, in time, equal the size even of Silicon Valley, is the whole notion of carbon management and what carbon management entails. The initials, CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, sequestration. All kinds of investment opportunities. It's helped with a price on carbon, but if we never get a price on carbon, it's still going to happen because it has to happen. The ability to take the CO2 and the other greenhouse gases emitted by what our industry does to produce energy is simply a matter of committing ourselves to waste management, a term we don't often use when it comes to carbon. But think about all the other waste that we manage in the lifestyles that we have, whether it's physical waste, whether it's liquid waste. And now isn't it time to turn our attention and our technical capability and our human capacity to managing gaseous waste and reusing that, capturing and reusing that gaseous waste, whether it's the CO2 or the sulfur, whatever it else SO2, whatever it is that we're producing, and treat it as it should be treated, which is a waste that does not belong on Earth. We have methods and we have companies, we have technologies that deal with all our physical waste. Same with liquid waste. Amazing that we're able to think comfortably about the price, the cost of managing such waste, because frankly, we don't otherwise want to deal with it. We want it to disappear. We want it to be reused if it's possible, but we don't want to have to deal with it, so let's take care of it. We have companies that do that. Well, carbon management is about dealing with gaseous waste. It's time. It's long past time, to be blunt. And whether it's the producer of that gaseous waste, like the oil and gas companies, or the consumer, who are also producers of gaseous waste, this is a shared responsibility. So I'm big on price of carbon. When I was Shell president in the early part of this century, between 2005, 2008, I was walking the halls of Congress arguing for a cap and trade system or a carbon tax. I'm in the public domain, every day talking about the need for a price on carbon. And what has our government done? Nothing, absolutely nothing, even though it is promised or committed. And whether it was the George W. Bush administration, the Barack Obama administration, we've lost all kinds of opportunities to get started on a price on carbon. But the pennies per gallon of gasoline represented, the pennies per BTU of natural gas that are represented in putting a price on carbon are minuscule versus what it can achieve in terms of putting the chemical engineers to work on reusing the gaseous waste that we capture, or turning the industry on to clean air capture of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. If you get a chance, Google Bill Gates and clean air capture, and you'll get a beautiful 15-minute video that will portray what Bill Gates, Chevron, Occidental, and BHP are doing to test a pilot test of clean air capture. This is not rocket science. This is basic technology that's been around for a very long time. We haven't had the leadership or the attempt to really make a go of it, but that's what's coming next. And the reason I say we will have oil and gas for our current graduates' grandchildren is the fact that we need this amount of energy for the world to do what it needs to do throughout the 21st century. And as this energy transition progresses through cleaning up what we do today, through increasing alternative uses of our supplies of energy, and then building the industry of carbon management, where University of Houston, Arizona State, MIT, numerous other universities, really putting the best minds in the world towards it, and the applications that are possible, and the product creation that's possible, taking gaseous waste and turning CO2 into fuel or whatever it may be, or into aggregate, and we store it as aggregate. The opportunities are really, frankly, just beginning. And I think it'll be an exciting time for alumni of this industry to look back and say, yes, I was there at the beginning. And I've really enjoyed watching over the course of 20, 30, 40 years, what's been accomplished. And we'll look back from that period and say, isn't the world a better place? And haven't we had wonderful careers to boot? So thanks everybody for listening.
That was great. And I really enjoyed that. And it feels almost like full circle. I remember I was commenting before we started that I first heard you speak in Second Life in 2008 when you were at the University of Delaware. So it was a really interesting experience. And you were talking about toward an energy policy and arguing for an energy policy, which as you gave us an update. Thank you. So I know we have some questions. I've elevated quite a few people to panelists just to see if that makes any difference, so that later when we have our question and answer, people can open their cameras. In the meantime, why don't we move ahead into our next one? And then we do have a question to mull over in the meantime from Patrick Ing. What is the current practice on managing risk of ESG? So anyway, John, I really want to thank you for your talk, and also for mentioning CCUS, because it made a perfect segue for Hamed Soroush, who will be talking about carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And Hamed, would you like to share your screen?
Yes, sure. Let me try. Can you see it, Susan?
Yes, I can. Yay!
Okay. Okay, thank you, Susan. Thank you very much. And I really enjoyed the previous, basically the talks. So basically the focus of my presentation is mainly the CCUS and where we are now and where we are heading. I would like to start this journey with a big appreciation to the oil and gas industry for all the good things that brought to us, to our lives. I think our lives are heavily engaged with oil and gas. I mean, if we look at our around, almost, I mean, everything that we touch is directly or indirectly related to oil and gas. More pronounced is in the medical industry. I mean, now that we are dealing with the COVID-19 and all the hassles, maybe we should think more about the contribution of oil and gas into the medical services. Now we have a good feeling of how important have to access to sanitizers, masks, all the things that we are running after these last few months and hardly found them. And honestly, I mean, if we do not really appreciate the bright side of the oil and gas, I would say the foundation for the clean energy movement is the wrong foundation. If we decide to eliminate oil and gas from our lives tonight, probably when we wake up tomorrow morning, we look like something like this. So we are actually, we should appreciate oil and gas. We should appreciate the learnings from oil and gas. John very nicely actually addressed that. And we believe that we need the 100 years of experience, more than 100 years of experience in oil and gas learnings, all the innovations, all the smart technologies that were developed to basically accelerate our movement toward clean energy and carbon neutral or carbon negative goal. So the ways forward, what should we do? I believe that, I mean, based on what I just explained, and I believe that oil and gas industry will stay with us for at least another century. And we need that to basically develop what we have in mind for a clean energy initiative. The first step is to make the oil and gas low carbon, right? We have to try to reduce the carbon emission from oil and gas. And there are many ways to do that. I mean, developing technologies, using optimizing our operations, moving from the older technologies to newer technologies, although they're costlier, more costly maybe. And I believe that in oil and gas industry, cost should not be a matter, because so far oil and gas has been actually making very good money for, and many of us actually made our lives through oil and gas money. When we talk about clean energy, reducing carbon emission, we should spend part of our benefit from oil and gas just to do that, and try to make the dark part of the oil and gas industry also bright. The next step is carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which is again closely tied to the oil and gas activities. So we have to clean up what we have done so far, and since zero carbon emission, we need more years to get to that point. We still need to basically either get rid of that CO2 that we are emitting, or turn it to more useful products. So I'm going to actually talk more about this step, and I mean look at it from different aspects. The third steps is then looking for new and sustainable sources for energy, including geothermal, solar, wind, and so on. And talking about these new sustainable or renewable energy sources, the concern that I would like to bring up here is because a lot of people that promote renewable energy basically sources, they try to hide the dark part of those technologies. Now, all of these technologies, solar, wind, they are not really 100% environmental friendly. So we know that solar panels, they have larger footprint than oil and gas. Wind turbines, they have negative impact on the environment. I have a PhD thesis from a student in Germany who actually lists all the negative environmental impact of wind energy, which is quite actually surprising and shocking. So I don't say that because I'm not a fan of these sources, but I believe that we have to be honest with public and ourselves, and don't do the mistake that we did in oil and gas industry. We have to address all those concerns and footprints from the beginning, not after 100 years that it's too late and people have a bad negative attitude toward that industry. So a little bit about our company and activities that we actually do toward these three goals. PetroLern is a tech company in the in providing solutions for carbon storage for geothermal energy and oil and gas. We are basically a group of oil and gas people trying to apply our experience and learnings from oil and gas to accelerate the movement toward cleaner energy sources. So our objectives are all clean energy, but we still believe that we need knowledge from oil and gas. So we are developing technologies to basically optimize the subsurface operations in oil and gas. And we are working on technologies that enable real-time decision making, real-time data transmission, real-time data processing, and sensor technology, artificial intelligence, and basically combining these new technologies, methodologies to make decision making, real time. We are also developing subsurface monitoring technologies for CO2 storage projects. We are working closely with the Department of Energy actually on some projects to try to increase the resolution of the CO2 movement monitoring under the ground to make that to make sure that the CO2 is safely stored. And among the new sources of energy, we are really focused on geothermal energy, which we believe can be one of the cleanest. So we are active in the reservoir exploration and characterization, and also developing new technologies for EGS. So going to the CCUS, just for those people who are not familiar with this technology, the aim of CCUS is to capture the CO2 either from the air or flue gas, to either convert it to other products which are of use, or store it underground, right? So the second C comes from capture. There are many projects, fundings, and activities going on to develop technologies, to develop methodologies to be able to capture the CO2 from the source or from the air. It's a very, very interesting, actually, field to do research and development in. The U comes from utilization. Again, there are actually many applications of CO2 that maybe are not commercialized or economic even right now, but in future they will be. But CO2 can be used for many actually good reasons. Currently, we are using CO2 in oil and gas to enhance recovery. This is, I think, it's the only economic basically use of CO2 capturing right now. But CO2 can be used, I mean, in the food industry. It can be actually converted to feedstocks that can be used in different industries, like in fire, suppression, in plastic industry, in inerting, actually, as inerting agents, refrigerants, chemicals. So there are many actually products that might be actually able to achieve by converting CO2. And there are many companies working in this space right now. It's very smart and very useful research and developments are going on in this space. And then the last basically part of the CCUS is a storage or sequestration, and that is injecting the CO2, the captured CO2, into the geological formations. So basically to either get rid of them, or I don't know, maybe keep them for future. Nobody knows, maybe 10 years from now we can convert CO2 to gold. So we should not store them somehow that we cannot recover them anymore. So typically the sequestration happens either in the unminable coal seams or deep saline formations. These are the two typical basic type of formations that currently are used for carbon sequestration. So just to give you a few numbers, according to the National Petroleum Council report, which was released December 2019, it's the most updated actually information I could find. The capacity of CO2 storage in the US only is 3,000 to 8,600 gigatons. So it's a huge capacity actually just within the US. Currently, there are 19 large-scale CCS projects operating worldwide, which 10 of them are actually in the United States. And the total storage volume of this project altogether is 32 million ton per annum. And out of this, again, 20 million ton per annum is part of the, I mean, it's the US basically. And according to the Department of Energy, CO2 is currently, CO2 storage is currently the only viable approach to isolate large volumes of CO2 from the atmosphere. So there are a lot of stress on these technologies. There are a lot of fundings by Department of Energy to help developing technologies, methodologies, workflows that are needed to make it happen actually. There are several pilot sites around the US that are testing different technologies. They're injecting CO2 under the ground. They're doing characterization. They're developing like screening tools to find the best formations for CO2 sequestration. But to relate the movement or basically CCUS initiatives with respect to the COVID-19, since this pivoting actually talk series are more relevant to the COVID-19, I want to actually share some of my own ideas about the situation of CCUS after COVID-19. I think all of us agree that, you know, COVID-19 showed how clean the air and the environment can be. There are many, of us that have seen wildlife getting closer to us, to our lives. Looking at many maps actually on Google, if you just Google it, you see maps comparing, different locations like China or Europe before and after, quarantine. And you see obvious difference between the quality of the air, the quality of the water, and this actually put a lot of pressure from public on the energy industry to make it cleaner, right? So it is doable. When the COVID-19 could do it, why human cannot do that, right? So I think after COVID-19, CCUS will have a stronger case actually to go ahead and develop opportunities. And also COVID-19 showed us how fragile the world's supply chain is. You know, we all noticed that even, powerful, economically powerful countries like US, during this time, they face, lack of enough supply for some simple products like toilet rolls that you would never actually before thought of being out of, toilet rolls. To find it hard to buy, or mask, or sanitizer, or anything else. Some of the food, foods or ingredients that we typically use every day, right? So it was a big learning for us to try to take advantage of all the sources that we can use to create feedstock, to create food, to make the world supply chain stronger. And one of those sources to me is CO2. And then having the situation with oil and gas, we have COVID-19 and we have low oil price, and there are a lot of people actually losing their jobs. So there are many smart resources available in the market which can potentially move to CCUS and help companies who are active in this space to develop, new technologies and make it and hasten this movement actually quite a lot. So to me, COVID-19 can help quite a lot accelerating CCUS and other actually renewable energy technologies. So what are the requirements for CCU, basically carbon storage? So to have a good sequestration reservoir, we need to have a reservoir with good porosity permeability. So it has enough capacity for CO2. And then we need to have a cap rock which is sealed enough to make sequestration safe with no risk of CO2 leak to the surface again. The current requirement, basically for more additional R&D. Susan, please stop me if I'm talking too much. Sorry, when I talk, I forget about time.
You're out of time.
I try to make it as short as possible.
Yeah, if you can finish up in like 30 seconds, and then we'll.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, we need to understand the basically interaction between gas and liquid, gas solid interaction to maximize the capacity of the reservoir. Monitoring, verification, and safe and permanent CO2 storage is a challenge right now. There are a lot of basically topics of interest to the Department of Energy for developing these technologies, and proactive mitigation system that can be used to inform real-time decisions now during the operation. Forecast and manage induced seismicity. So induced seismicity is challenge, I mean, for CO2 storage as much as it is for hydraulic fracturing. So the biggest actually challenge or barrier against carbon CCUS overall is the cost. But to me, cost should not be really a big barrier because we are paying for the price of a low carbon energy transition, right? So these technologies that we need for CCUS right now will be cheaper in future, but even right now, I think the government should continue funding and paying basically for this initiative and goal. CO2 is currently the only economical application for CCS, and
okay, Simon, let's go ahead and go to the next one because we're
sure. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. I was almost done anyway. So
it's really easy to go way deep into this, so we'll have time later.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So anyway, as Hamid gets his I'd like to introduce Rick Schrynemeeckers, who will be after Hamid, and just wanted to point out that CCUS is extremely important right now in a lot of operations in Europe. So it's definitely up and coming. It's just like you pointed out, cost. We can go into that more in the discussion. So thank you, Rick.
You're welcome. Thank you for the introduction. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, what I wanted to share today with is I know that we've had a lot of individuals that have left the industry to go into other avenues that they perceive as more stable, or just to get a paycheck, or they're tired of the up and down. And I know a lot of friends of mine that are geologists have gone into the environmental business. And so in talks with them, I wanted to share some technology, or if you're just into environmental engineering and contamination renewal and removal, wanted to share some advances in technology that some of our friends in the industry may not be aware of, since they're either new in the environmental industry or it's been a while since they've participated, and hopefully they'll find this information helpful as they go forth. So just to give you a little background, we are amplified geochemical imaging, and what we make is a passive sorber. You see that in the bottom left-hand corner, that little white module. It's actually stretched Teflon, so the outside of that is a semi-permeable membrane, and on the inside of that, I don't know if you can see my cursor, is this specially engineered sorber that actually is designed to absorb and hold on to a variety of environmental contaminants that I'll talk about in a minute. So these small sorbers are placed into the ground over a contaminated site. You drill a hole about 1 inch in diameter, about 3 feet or 1 meter deep. You lower those modules in the ground. You leave them there anywhere from 5 days to 2 weeks typically. And so they can be used for a variety of purposes that I'll talk about. The laboratory that we use uses a modified EPA method 8260, if you're familiar with that. And our methods are accredited by A2LA and the Department of Defense. And we do work all around the world, to be honest. So the surveys that we get involved in are typically done in industrial manufacturing, petroleum refineries, chemical plants, dry cleaners, military bases, pipelines, landfills, just about anything, and anything from air quality to contamination of water plumes and anything that you can really think of. And the things that we monitor are dry cleaning fluids, gasolines, diesels, fuel additives, jet fuels, solvents, pesticides, explosive warfare agents, actually, mineral spirits, herbicides, you name it, we can do it. So I want to go through just a couple of case studies, 2 of them. I'm not going to talk long about this one because I really want to focus on the next one. But this was a site where they knew they had a groundwater contamination problem with distillates from C7 to C10. Groundwater was about 1 to 7 meters deep. And they had, the environmental engineering firm had prepared a plan for the state regulatory agency that relied on 33 ground monitoring wells to be monitored over quite a few years. The benefit of using a technology like this, I guess I should step back and say, typically if you've been involved in the environmental industry and you're going into it now, you realize the typical strategy, you do a phase 1, looking at the paperwork to find out what's been on the site, what could have been spilled where, and then they dig up soil samples everywhere to try to define that plume. And since they're digging and volatiles and certain contaminants can be released to the air, they rush those samples to environmental laboratories. They're analyzed on a 24-hour or 48-hour basis, which is extremely expensive and costs the clients a lot of money. The niche for this technology is the ability to map the contamination and then reduce your costs by reducing the cleanup costs. So in this case, we did a plume map for this distillate, and the purple and red represent really high concentrations, and the yellow and green are low concentrations, and the blue and gray are actually background concentrations, or those concentrations that are below the maximum contaminant level by the state. So when the client did this survey, they now realize that, oh wow, this site is not nearly as contaminated as we previously thought. And they went back to the regulatory agency and said, look at this map. We think we could reduce the number of groundwater monitoring wells that need to be installed. They were able to do that. The state agreed to reduce it from 33 to 15. And they saved the first year for their client $155,000 and an ongoing $100,000 each year. So by doing this, they were able to reduce the cost to the client and really direct a better cleanup process for the environment. So let me talk to you about this one. This one is pretty interesting, actually. This took place in Toole Army Depot in Utah quite a few years ago. And it was really interesting because they had a large chlorinated volatile organic compound contaminant plume that had been pretty well defined. And they had been working at this site for quite a few years, for 7 years actually. Depth to groundwater was somewhere between 30 and 125 meters, depending where you were on the property. And the pump and treat cost for this large area was $2 million a year. The problem they ran into is during the year, they would notice through monitoring that they were reducing the contaminant of trichloroethene, TCE, but then it kept bouncing back up. They would reduce through the year again, and it kept bouncing back up. And after 7 years, they essentially made no progress in reducing the contamination problem. So they still had 23 years to go and they weren't making any progress. So this is a map that shows you the focus area of the site. All the yellow dots represent where we put modules in the ground. It was an 800-acre site. We used 950 samples over 5 phases, and the spacing between the modules was anywhere from 15 meters to 100 meters. And so you can see the blue circle in the middle there where they suspected that was the contamination site, or the highly sourced site rather, and groundwater was moving from the south to the east, and they had in the northern portion unlined water ditches, and so they had some serious problems. When we got the results for the survey, it was quite interesting. As predicted, there was some strong contamination here in the central part with TCE, but what the client couldn't understand was all of this, in this linear column here, all of this TCE concentration or contamination. And this little patch off to the east, these were just office buildings and open area. To anybody's knowledge, there should be no contamination out here, and that was quite a surprise to everybody. When they investigated the site, they actually found an oil and water separator that had been buried and forgotten about, and they found 6,000 pounds of TCE sludge in there. And what would happen is they had a storm drain that went from east to west, and each time they got a rain event, in Utah, they have a long dry season, but when they did get a rain event, this would fill up the sewer, the contamination would run down the sewer, and you begin to get a plume moving northward because that's the direction of the groundwater flow. And so they would begin to make progress in cleaning it up, and then when they get another rain event, they get a recirculation. So that was an eye-opening event that allowed them to identify the source of the problem. They also found that they had a PCE problem though, perchloroethylene. And the problem with that was there were no records of having PCE on the site. But when this was identified, they went back through the records and they actually found that they did have PCE stored in here for quite a few years, but it was misrecorded as TCE, and so they had never looked for this particular contaminant. So to bring the plane down, they had an unidentified source for recontamination, and they had also an unknown source for perchloroethylene. So after they found what the source was and the contamination was with the oil and water separator, they were able to, after 2 years of remediation with pump and treat, to bring the levels below the MCL levels for the state and save themselves 20 years in remediation effects. The total survey cost $400,000, but they saved themselves roughly $40 million in costs. So I just wanted to share that if you're going into the environmental business from the oil and gas business, and it's been a while since you've worked there or you're new to it, that this might be a tool that you can bring into the shop to address some of the problems that you run into, not only saving your clients money, but defining a much clearer path towards remediation of sites and more success on environmental cleanups. So I hope that some of my friends that move over into the industry might be able to use this to their benefit and be ultra successful, and they'll go in looking really smart, like they know what they're doing, and hopefully you'll have a long, prosperous career in the environmental business. Thank you, Susan. I appreciate the opportunity to share tonight.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. And if you're new to our series, the structure is that we try to give an overview of where the investment is going, where the needs are, and a kind of big picture. And then we give 2 case studies of companies that have pivoted or are sharing ideas about how you can pivot. So the whole idea is to like get ideas, suggestions, etc. So really appreciate it. So I want to see if you can open up your microphones if you have a question out there in the audience, and also as we do so, want to recognize Elvira Gomez, who's our president of the AAPG Latin America region. Elvira, would you like to say a few words?
Hi,
And
Susan. Thank you very much.
you can open your, you should be able to open your video too.
Okay, let me just see.
I elevated you to panelist, so it should be able to, but.
Yeah, okay, let's see. You can start your video because the host has stopped it. So probably not.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, thank you very much, Susan. This has been quite an enlightening conversation. I think that all the, the people that you invite, it's quite had a strong point in here. And these kind of conversations are really important because as you know, people right now has to think in the future, and the future is here. One of the panelists just said that this pandemic, the COVID-19, just has shown us how we can do better, that we need to do better, that we need to think ourselves in a different way. And I think that's what we have to say all the time to all the people, because there is not going to be just one of us doing the change. It has to be all of us working in the same direction. And this is kind of really, really great, especially I know that in North America and Europe, Asia, these kind of projects are kind of easy to follow. Here in Latin America, we are just starting. There is a big market in here.
Try your camera now. See if you can do it. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in. Just. Yay!
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Susan. Yeah, I was saying that we are trying to bring to Latin America and the Caribbean this kind of topics to discuss, to start discussing. I know there are like private young people trying to work into new projects. And I think this is kind of the project that the new generation has to work on. So we're going through that. And thank you, Susan. I think that's all.
Oh, thank you. So I noticed that Maitri Irwin is in the audience too. Would you like to say a few words? Let's see. Where are you? She may have gone.
Hey, Susan, this is Rick. Before he comes on, I just wanted to ask, Elvira brought up the discussion topic of change, and that's been mentioned several times tonight in previous pivot sessions as well. But we've also talked about the oil and gas industry doesn't seem to be one of the most nimble industries in terms of change. So how do we change? I mean, we seem to be really terrible at changing in innovation and accepting new ideas. So while we all agree we need to change, how do we get there? How do we invoke change in our industry? Because I have to be honest and say, I don't know.
I wonder if John or Alex could answer that.
From my perspective, it really comes to the individual. What does an individual know? How does he or she know it? And what do they do with what they know? And if they think about what impact they could make as individuals, they really kind of just push the status quo. I realize that there are different cultures in different companies. And sometimes culture is a handicap to change because the culture just doesn't allow for the innovation or for the raised voices to be heard. In that case, you may want to think about whether you're in the right culture and make changes. In my own case, I changed companies 4 times in my career because I kept looking for where could I make the greatest difference. And so I think the first of all is a commitment of oneself to being a change maker, and then look around for colleagues or peer group or role models and learn from them. Because I've never felt like I was ultimately held back because I could always make choices to do what I chose to do. So it's really a self-motivating, a self-driven effort. And I agree with you, in general, there's very rigid adherence to the status quo in energy companies, and it's going to cost us those license to operate. So I think encouraging people to change, that's what it's all about.
John, I would add to that, sorry, just that I've seen that the changes that happen when you have to. And companies are like that. So,
that's true.
I mean, if you just notice the numbers for all of the companies in the last 3 months, I know it's just really short period of time, but it's still are really bad. Yeah, they were expecting to make some earnings. They didn't reach that. And on top of that, they are losing money. Big ones, small ones. And that, let me tell you, I've seen a big in the top of the companies. They are thinking about it. They are making changes. You know, all of the big companies are having kind of a sustainable department. They are working through renewable because they see the business. I think the big word in here is, what is the energy business? And if you want to be part of that. The changing, it's coming. At least here in Latin America and in North America, I've seen it. So they want to be part of that. They are preparing themselves. Big companies I'm talking about, Total, Cepsa, BP, Shell, just name it. So probably if you're referring to short period of time, yeah, we're not going to change one day to the other. But I think it is important that we know that they are doing it and we embrace it, and we just push the young generation to start working just to reach that along with the companies.
Oh, that's great. Alex, did you?
Yeah, well, there's two things I think we see going on. One is, certainly the reason that oil and gas companies haven't been moving into the space is because the return on capital hasn't been there. So until the return on capital is there, or you have the external price signals, such as carbon taxes and things like that, that change the return on capital equation, they're not going to move because they're bent on return for shareholders, as partially they should be. But so we're seeing two things. So, if you have been following, E&I kind of cut their company in half just recently, and I wouldn't be surprised if Shell and others do the same thing, where you begin separating your assets type, and where you're going to have a return on capital on renewable assets that's different than oil and gas, and they'll be just transferring assets from one company to the other. So I think that's medium term. Short term, what we're trying to do is let companies know that there's money on the table, and they are all motivated by money. And so we come in and try to integrate and break down the barriers between the sustainability ESG department that typically just does reports and says how much gas they're flaring, and what's going on the operation side and what's going on in the innovation side, and saying by looking at these things holistically, you actually can save money, so return money to something else, or you can make money, and more importantly, you can manage risk. And the difficult conversation is to get them to understand that how much risk there is in climate change, and have them to accept that that's a real risk category, similar to oil price. You'll not find any independent oil and gas company out there that doesn't hedge its oil and gas portfolio on sales. Similarly, out there, it's like if you're hedging oil and gas, you should be hedging around climate change, and the way you hedge is by changing what you do. You don't pay 10, 20, $50 million for an option in the market. You put that $50 million to work in changing how your company does business. And that's what we work on, to help them understand that it's just part of doing business is doing that, and get them moving in that right direction. Because if they don't see that as a financial mechanism, they're not going to do something.
That's a really good point. And I think RP, I see the initials.
Yeah. Yeah, may I ask a couple of quick questions? I'm glad Alexander hit on that point so beautifully.
Oh, also open up your camera. I made you a code.
Oh, sure. Okay. It is taking time.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So I appreciate the points raised by Alexander. Having been exposed to the angel and venture capital in the biotechnology industry, which is much smaller and is much more nimble if you take one industry at a time, because compared to the oil and gas, which is the infrastructure wise is so huge. That's one reason. And the other one is just for the sake of change, let us not change what has worked so well so far. You only have to look at the 8-year span before, 3 years before now, what happened when people wanted change. That's one point. And also finally, the people who invest the money in it have to be convinced that they can at least expect a reasonable return on investment. One other question about from the scientific standpoint is, as far as the CO2 capture goes, maybe I missed it, but was there any mention to the huge biomass that's available in this under the sea in the form of algae? I do not know whether it is photosynthetically less efficient or more efficient than the C4 plants that we have on Earth. But is that, has that been looked into as a possible contributor for CO2? In that case, photosynthetically less efficient plant would be favorable for your use than the more efficient C4 plants. That's my question.
I can answer that if, you know, I spoke at an algae conference for some strange reason.
Okay.
Algae, in terms of CO2 sequestration, that is going to be on land. So no one's going to be planning to go out to sea to do algae because that's more of bioengineering. And no one's quite ready to accept bioengineering as a solution, such as putting in iron filings and seeding the oceans for phytoplankton growth. So that's there. I would not be at all surprised if, you know, a country like India or China or someone else who really kind of felt, you know, at some point they need to make a decision. They'll make the decision for the whole world, and similar to sulfur dioxide seeding of the skies. You can unilaterally change the temperature of the world that way. But if you're doing it from an economic point of view as a business, I think there's going to be very interesting things in terms of algae for protein growth. What, you know, maybe that protein is going to go to fish rather than, you know, killing fish to feed fish. You know, we'll be growing algae from CO2 and using that as protein for fish or insects, which will go up the food chain. There's a number of companies that are doing that, and I think the particularly exciting part is if you can begin using, you know, saline waters and not having to use fresh water for that, and tying that with solar and renewable energy. It's still a very early stage business, but there's, you know, commercial scale companies that are, you know, have projects out there that I have no idea when, if ever, that will grow big enough to make a difference. It takes a huge amount of land to do that.
Thank you. If I may, yes or no question to Dr. Hofmeister. Are you in any way related to the Franz Hofmeister of the famous Hofmeister series of ions?
No, sorry about that.
Good question. So I think that Patrick Ng had a question earlier. Patrick, do you want to open up your mic and your camera?
Hey, Susan, thank you. I would just like to ask the panelists, as far as managing the risk of this ESG, what are some of the examples? I'm curious.
So managing the risk of ESG.
It really comes to reputation. What is the reputation that a company wishes to develop for itself in the marketplace? Is it going to be as a leader, a laggard, or just keep their head in the sand? I think reputation management is a very important part, from the board of directors to the executive committee to the workforce as a whole. And ESG is what message you are ultimately giving to investors, because it's the investors who judge you on your ESG contribution. I mentioned Larry Fink's letter. Larry Fink is laying down the gauntlet to energy companies to say, if you want investment funds in the future, you have got to get a grip on your role in climate change prevention. And you have got to convince me, as the head of BlackRock, with $1 trillion to spend on future investment, you have got to convince me that your investors will see a return on the commitment that you make to impact the greenhouse gas issues of Earth and the biodiversity of Earth. And if your business model is not set up to show the actions which you are willing to take, we're not going to fund you. And we're going to vote against you at shareholder meetings. That's a very big deal. When someone like BlackRock, who might own your shares, votes against you at shareholder meetings through their rights as shareholders, that's a very serious issue. And boards of directors and who represent shareholders at companies and executive committees pay serious attention. Larry Fink's letter has been read millions of times, I can assure you, by shareholders, by senior executives, by boards of directors, because it carries an awful lot of weight.
Alex, those were great. Thank you. Thank you, John. That was great. And Alex said, while you were talking, put an illustrative slide together. So it was really perfect.
Yeah, I'm very quick with illustrative slides. That was a great point, John. I just have, that was one of the presentations I did some months ago, but it was exactly to John's point. It was a presentation on, what will drive oil and gas operations to change. And it was, the point of the presentation was, it was reputation, and we put together these number of slides that just basically these scorecards by various NGOs about where everyone is, and then guess who uses those scorecards? Well, it's the investors, because and so no one wants to be at the bottom of the scorecard or below 50%. So it's a kind of a race, rather than race to the bottom, it's a race to the top, where right now, what Equinor is, and Total and Shell and Eni are at the top, and you can find a lot of folks at the bottom. But they recognize that there's, this affects the capital markets and on their ability to raise money, and so they're, it's moving them, and that's, it's all due to reputational issues at the shareholder level and at the equity raising level.
That brings up an interesting point about national oil companies, and I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but we do have a person who's an attendee who's often. He's from Thailand National Oil Company, and John Thampat, if you'd like to comment, that would be great. If not, I understand. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I wonder if national oil companies feel the same kind of reputational pressure as the ones that have that are public companies. Well, I think I put him on the spot. But anyway, I'm excited that he's always here. And it's in the morning. We often have people from Japan as well, which is pretty cool. Anyway, so any other thoughts about, well, Elvira, so you're from the perspective of Latin America. Do you think that reputational issues are as compelling?
Yeah. Actually, here in Latin America, what we have seen, it's the social license to operate. We do not have that. Just said it like that. I mean, it's not everyone, but it mostly. We have big issues in the whole region compelling to that. And that has been saying a legacy of all times, where there were not enough or really good institutionality, where environment was not the key point on any of our activities. Right now, companies are doing a lot better in terms of environment, social responsibility, and all those things that are really important. And we are trying to create a better reputation. But in general, all of the projects have been just stopped because people do not want to have oil industry on their lands. And the other fact is that we have a different system that you do have there in North America. Our land is not, I mean, the owner is not the owner of the subsurface, but it is the state. So implication is that you as an owner of the land, you're not getting much more about that, just giving it to the oil industry. So this is an issue. We are trying to work on that hardly. All of the companies are trying and putting a lot of money on that. Still, there are programs that have been just stopped by the communities. And that is that we do not have the social license to operate. But what John was saying, it's quite applicable in here. And that is hurting the economy of all the operators, national ones and international.
That's interesting. I know that we have a few people from Latin America or South America. Andres is here, and also Angel Taday. If either one of you would like to comment too, that would be great. Sorry to put you on the spot. So.
Okay.
Great.
Hi, Angel Taday speaking.
And you can open up your camera too, I think. Let me see.
If you decide, yeah, that's okay. No worries. But basically, yeah, basically, I'm attending these kind of meetings because also I enjoy to learn more things, especially from emerging industries such as you and the doctors and Alexander, Hamed, Miss John, Elvira, or Eric, or everybody is speaking on. And if you ask me about the reputation of the national oil companies, basically in Ecuador we have PetroEcuador, and we have a big problem with contamination a long time ago. It's basically because at that time we didn't have very strong rules. So for the reason, I think they managed as they could at that time. And I think it's a good idea to have better options for the future, trying to clean it up, those messes basically. About the reputation, basically it has PetroEcuador or Petroamazonas, which is the upstream operator. It's not a very good reputation now.
Do you think there's a lack of trust?
Yeah, it's also the lack of it's a lot of also the politics, because remember when the government arrives to the power, basically they put some authorities to manage that key industries in the country, and most of them are just economics, but not as G&G staff, for instance. So that could affect things a long time ago. Or people just said, cut the cost, and that is also affected the reputation.
That's interesting. Speaking of economics, Dr. Davis, as our resident economist, do you have any thoughts? You're muted. Okay, good.
Probably not. I'm just sitting back enjoying and listening. These are pretty complex subjects that you're into tonight, and although you call me economist, some of the things I've heard are above my head.
Well, it gets pretty technical, but I think the whole issue of the cost, bringing up the cost of trust or lack of trust is pretty interesting too. And John, did you have some thoughts?
What goes to a more fundamental point is, do the companies exist for their shareholders, which has long been held? And I remember a CEO of a very famous American oil and gas company, the granddaddy of them all, ExxonMobil, who said in a public setting probably 10 years ago, he works for his shareholders. And anything that is not in the interest of his shareholders doesn't interest him in terms of decision-making, priority setting, strategy setting, etc. What has emerged over the last decade since he retired from that position is something that's called stakeholder capitalism, where instead of shareholder capitalism, It's called stakeholder capitalism, where there are 5 basic stakeholders, one of whom are shareholders. Another is employees. Another is communities. Another is supply chain. Another is government, or society at large, if you will. So if you approach your business, your reputation, your future business model, return on capital, return on investment, etc., only thinking about shareholders, that might limit what responsibilities you have in a world that is moving towards stakeholder capitalism, where nobody can afford to suffer. Like in the example of Petroecuador, the society of Ecuador has seriously suffered from the pollution that was really left to rot many decades ago. And that's probably, what, 30, 40 years ago. And so society has been offended by that. Or maybe you don't treat your employees the way they deserve to be treated. Or maybe you don't treat your suppliers the way they deserve to be treated. And the communities around in the society in which you operate, and respect for the government. So looking after these multiple stakeholders, I think, is an important part of how you manage reputation going forward. And it's becoming ever clearer. And that really is the basic message that I think is really circulating through boards of directors now and through executive committees of companies. How do we approach this stakeholder capitalism?
That's a really good point. And that whole notion of stakeholder has expanded to be more inclusive, which we're seeing that thankfully happening in just increasing awareness. So the future will probably have a lot more diversity of opinion and also of technology and solutions. I just wanted to thank everyone. It looks like we're out of time, but before I thank our speakers again, I want to also thank Mark Hamzat and recognize his efforts. He's really helping with AAPG UPitch. Also, Hani El-Shahawi is also doing a lot with UPitch. And Julia Lemaster is doing a lot with Embers in Transition. Patrick Ng is in Energy and Data and also UPitch. And on and on, I won't, but I also want to especially thank Elvira for being here tonight. And so thank again our panelists. That was just fantastic tonight, very technical and good. So Larry Davis, Rick Schrynemeeckers, Hamid Soroush, Alex Rozenfeld, and John Hofmeister. So thank you. Just wanted to let everybody know that you'll get an email from me with links and contact information. I hope to see you back next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Susan.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Susan. Thank you all the panelists.